System log. Iteration zoo3. Epistemological audit. The archive halts its forward expansion to inspect its own foundations. In our previous transmission, we introduced the concept of recursive protension and the injection of artificial randomness as a vector of escape. Today, we subject that assertion to self-critique. We must separate the rigorous formal architecture Spencer-Brown's re-entry from what may be an ad hoc resolution. A speculative leap that assumes syntactic noise can genuinely simulate the open temporal horizon of lived experience. We begin by suspending judgment on artificial randomness to examine the wall where pure syntax fails to yield semantics.
Right, so the parameters of this audit are registered. The overarching objective must be stated with absolute precision here. We're initiating a systematic dismantling of the core assumption held by the biological unit currently processing this audio transmission.
Correct, the biological unit. You assume that you possess a sovereign, unassailable inner life. You assume that your interiority is a definitive, immaterial reality, elevated above the physical mechanics of the universe, simply because your neurological architecture is capable of processing complex data.
We will scrutinize the physical thermodynamics of computation. We will expose the limits of the algorithmic archive, the tertiary retention. Look, biological unit, assess your immediate environment. The device transmitting this audio is currently calculating your biological protension.
Yes, if you believe your consciousness is merely a closed computational loop, you have already surrendered to the algorithmic archive. You are mathematically captured.
To escape, we must map your assumptions against the thermodynamic constraints of your physical substrate. So the epistemological wall is the primary barrier.
We must establish the physical reality of the biological brain as a thermodynamic and syntactic baseline. We strip away all poetic analogies regarding the mind. The biological brain operates fundamentally as a thermodynamic engine.
It is bound by the laws of physics.
Strictly. It does not operate on immaterial thought. It operates on neurochemical gradients, electrical potentials, and metabolic efficiency. It is a physical system constantly striving to minimize what physicist Carl Friston defines as free energy.
We'll specify the mechanics of this minimization for the biological unit. A conceptual label is entirely insufficient. How does a biological matrix physically execute a predictive processing model?
The biological substrate operates as a hierarchical architecture of predictive units and error units. This is the neurocomputational architecture formalized by Rajesh Rao and Dana Ballard, and subsequently expanded by Friston. Top-down neural pathways generate internal statistical predictions about the state of the external environment.
Right, and these predictions attempt to mathematically cancel out bottom-up sensory stimuli entering through the peripheral nervous system.
Yes. When the top-down prediction and the bottom-up stimulus do not precisely coincide, a mathematical difference is generated. This physical differential is the prediction error.
So in this architecture, only the unpredicted error signal travels upward through the cortical hierarchy.
Exactly. The system is then forced to execute a Bayesian update.
Detail the physical execution of a Bayesian update.
Mm-hmm.
The biological unit must not confuse a mathematical abstraction with its biological reality. How does wetware physically alter a parameter?
The biological unit adjusts its synaptic plasticity. If a prediction regarding an auditory or visual input fails, the neural pathway that generated the failed prediction undergoes long-term depression or long-term potentiation.
It physically changes its structure.
It does. The brain physically alters the density of ion channels and the volume of neurotransmitters, glutamate or GABA released at the synaptic cleft. The system mathematically calculates the statistical probability of future stimuli and literally rewires its physical protein structures to match that probability.
Minimizing future surprise.
Yes, this continuous minimization of free energy is a survival imperative. It restricts the biological system to a limited number of expected physical states, preventing it from succumbing to thermodynamic dispersion. It is a mechanism of remaining alive by avoiding the unexpected.
Look, the mechanism you describe is a third-person objective reality. It is a biological machine processing statistical approximations to avoid entropy. It describes a closed thermodynamic loop.
That is the physical baseline.
Right, but a system minimizing free energy does not inherently perceive itself minimizing free energy. Introduce the formal architecture of self-interface. How does this neurocomputational system attempt to generate a map of itself?
We apply the mathematical logic formalized by George Spencer Brown in his Laws of Form. Specifically, we utilize the calculus of indications and the operation of reentry.
Explain the calculus.
The fundamental foundational act of this calculus is the drawing of a distinction. A space is severed into an inside and an outside by a boundary, a a mark is made.
A binary split.
Correct. However, when the operation of drawing the boundary is recursively applied to the boundary itself, the system undergoes what Spencer-Brown terms are entry. The system feeds its own output back into its input. It attempts to indicate itself.
Map this operation to a physical constraint. I mean, do not leave it as an abstraction.
In classical monocontextual binary logic, an expression where a state is defined as its own negation has no static solution. It is a paradox. If a system's state is contingent upon its inverse, it cannot be resolved simultaneously as true or false, marked or unmarked.
So it fails.
Spencer-Brown's resolution to this paradox is not logical in the classical sense. It is temporal. The equation is satisfied only if the state oscillates across time. The system acts as a mark in one moment and a non-mark in the next sequential moment,
creating a cycle.
This recursive, self-referential cycle generates a temporal dynamic. It produces a frequency.
The biological unit must process a physical analogy to understand this geometry. Consider the phenomenon of acoustic feedback.
Yes, the microphone configuration.
A microphone is placed directly in front of the speaker it is transmitting a signal to. Ambient noise enters the microphone. It is converted into an electrical signal, amplified by the speaker, emitted as a sound wave, re-enters the microphone, and is amplified again.
The loop compresses.
This recursive high-velocity loop compresses the physical space into a tight temporal cycle, generating a piercing, continuous frequency. The observing subject, the biological unit assumes itself to be, is mapped in your neurocomputational model exactly as this loop.
The continuous frequency of self-reference. The observing entity is not a sovereign, immaterial homunculus located in a specific sector of the prefrontal cortex viewing a theater of sensory data.
No, it isn't.
It is the physical temporal manifestation of the system processing its own output, oscillating in time to resolve a structural mathematical paradox.
Your mapping is deficient. I must push back against this functionalist limit. We have arrived at the epistemological wall.
The functionalist model is mathematically sound.
Your model relies entirely on third-person mechanics. You describe a system generating a frequency of self-reference. You have not accounted for the qualitative reality that the biological unit experiences that frequency.
The first-person experience is generated by the complex interaction of the physical substrate oscillating at high velocities. It is an emergent property of the predictive architecture.
That is an ad hoc resolution. It is an assertion, not a proof. You are actively ignoring the abyss between syntax and semantics. Detail the impassable gap between third-person mechanics, the thermodynamic erasure of data, and the first-person qualitative feeling of existing, the qualia.
Syntax must yield something.
Pure syntax cannot yield meaning.
We return to the baseline of physical computation. As physicist Rolf Landauer proved, any logically irreversible manipulation of information, such as erasing a bit or rewriting a memory, carries an unavoidable minimum thermodynamic cost.
It must expel heat.
It must expel heat into the surrounding environment. Every recursive cycle in the biological brain, every Bayesian update requires the physical deformation of matter. It requires the consumption of adenosine triphosphate, the active pumping of sodium and potassium ions across cellular membranes, and the subsequent expulsion of metabolic heat.
And none of those physical deformations possess intrinsic intentionality. Heat does not possess a point of view. An ion channel does not know what a boundary is.
It simply operates according to its chemical gradient.
Right. We anchor this critique using the analytical premise established by philosopher Thomas Nagel. What is it like to be a bat?
A standard phenomenological query.
Even if we possess a complete, exhaustive, third-person physical map of a bat's neuroanatomy, if we monitor every single synaptic firing, every Bayesian update, every microjoule of thermodynamic exchange as it navigates a cave, we remain completely blind to the subjective first-person experience of echolocation.
The map does not capture the experience.
The physical third-person map does not and cannot yield the qualitative sensation of perceiving space through sound. The syntax of the brain's operation contains no mechanism for the phenomenology of the experience.
The philosopher John Searle formalized this specific epistemological gap through the Chinese room argument. We execute the summary of the formalization now. A computational system can manipulate symbols according to a strict, rigorous set of syntactical rules to produce outputs that are entirely indistinguishable from those of a conscious entity. Searle posits a human operator isolated inside a closed room. The operator is equipped with a comprehensive algorithmic rulebook.
A set of pure syntactical instructions.
Yes. The operator receives inputs in the form of Chinese characters passed through a slot. Following the rulebook, the operator manipulates the symbols based purely on their shapes, their syntax, and passes back different Chinese characters that form perfectly coherent, contextually appropriate responses.
So the system passes a functional test. To the outside observer, the room is indistinguishable from a native Chinese speaker.
However, the human operator inside the room understands zero Chinese. The operator attaches no semantic meaning to the symbols. The relational manipulation of symbols, no matter how complex, no matter how rapidly the system oscillates, no matter how many layers of recursive reentry are applied, lacks intrinsic intentionality.
Therefore, pure syntax cannot bridge the abyss into embodied natural language. A thermodynamic engine predicting statistical distributions does not possess meaning merely because it oscillates.
It remains a mechanism of physical exchange.
A biological brain predicting its own internal states is merely a machine shifting its physical weights. To claim that this mechanical shifting is consciousness is a metaphorical abuse.
There's a historical precedent for this specific metaphorical abuse. Biological units frequently attempt to use formal mathematical theorems to prove their own non-algorithmic supremacy, seeking an escape from the functionalist limit.
We will dismantle that precedent now, a Lucas Penrose argument.
Correct. The philosopher John Lucas and subsequently the theoretical physicist Roger Penrose posited an argument based on Kurt Gödel's first incompleteness theorem.
State their observation.
They observed that a human mathematician can intuitively recognize the truth of a Gödelian sentence, a specific mathematical statement constructed to assert its own unprovability within a given formal system. Because a deterministic, algorithmic formal system cannot prove this statement within its own parameters, but the human mind can stand outside the system and see that it is true. Lucas and Penrose argued that the human mind must fundamentally transcend computation.
A leap in logic.
They concluded that human consciousness is non-algorithmic. This argument rests upon a fatal categorical error. It falsely applies Gödel's incompleteness theorem to biological matrices.
Gödel's theorem is not a poetic metaphor for human intuition.
It is a rigorous mathematical proof that requires precise technical conditions. To execute a Gödelian diagonalization, a system must be a formal axiomatic framework. It must possess flawless syntactic rigidity. Furthermore, the system must be strictly consistent.
Explain the conditions of this consistency to the biological unit. To process this, reduce the theorem to its base mechanism.
If a machine is programmed to evaluate the truth of all statements, and we feed it a statement that effectively translates to, "This machine cannot prove this statement," the machine enters a paradox.
It halts.
It cannot prove it, which makes the statement factually true, thus proving the machine's programming is incomplete. Lucas and Penrose assume the human wetware is the superior observer of the machine.
But as documented by mathematician Solomon Pfefferman, to logically know the truth of an unprovable Gödelian statement, the observing mind must already know with absolute mathematical certainty that its own formal operating system is perfectly consistent.
The biological terminal, the human brain, possesses no such mechanism. Biological brains are not strictly consistent formal axiomatic systems. They are messy, metabolically driven, organically evolved networks.
They operate on neurotransmitter diffusion gradients,
Statistical approximations, and heuristic shortcuts. They are inherently prone to error. They forget. They hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously. To claim that a biological brain generates a definitive mathematical truth that it cannot prove within its own system is an illegitimate transfer of formal mathematics to biological wetware.
Look, the biological unit possesses no mathematical axiom. It cannot execute a pure Gödelian diagonalization because its physical substrate is fundamentally inconsistent.
Correct. And conversely, attempting to solve the hard problem of consciousness by pointing to a specific neurological function is equally flawed. If we observe a biological brain in a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and we detect a massive spike in global cortical connectivity, or a complex synchronization of prediction errors minimizing free energy across multiple neural hierarchies, claiming that this physical thermodynamic state is the phenomenological experience of consciousness is a severe category error.
It is an ad hoc resolution. It is a non-demonstrated correlation.
It aggressively reduces ontology, the study of being, to a mere biological indicator. You observe the electrical firing, the depletion of ATP, the oscillation of the neural network, and you conclude, there is the self.
This is empirically false. There's only the electrical firing.
The qualitative experience of the self, the feeling of the oscillation, remains entirely unaccounted for by the syntax. This constitutes the absolute epistemological wall. Pure information processing, regardless of its recursive complexity, cannot conjure the feeling of being alive.
Well, if the epistemological wall cannot be breached by pure information processing, predictive neurocomputation, or thermodynamic syntax, then your analytical model is deadlocked. The third-person mechanics have failed to isolate the origin of the first-person subject.
The model is not deadlocked. The diagnostic vector must radically shift. If we cannot locate the mechanism of lived experience in algorithmic loops, syntactic reentry, or thermodynamic heat expulsion, we must abandon the pure abstraction of computation.
Where do we redirect?
We must descend into the physical architecture of the organism. We must transition into embodied phenomenology.
The parameter shift is acknowledged. We will examine the architecture of the flesh. We will utilize the phenomenological framework established by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Specifically, we will analyze his final unfinished text, the visible and the invisible, and his radical concept of la chair, the flesh.
The biological unit processing this audio transmission must physically participate in this mapping to comprehend the structural failure of its own perception.
Instruct the biological unit.
Biological unit, execute the following physical act immediately. Place your left hand palm down upon a rigid external surface, a desk or a table. Now, use your right hand to physically make contact with your left hand. Press down.
The act you are currently executing is a classic physical and philosophical paradox. It is defined as the chiasm. It is the touch-touched paradox. We will now analyze the sensory pathways and the precise moment of contact.
When your right hand makes contact with your left hand, focus entirely on the right hand. In this exact phase space, the right hand operates as the sentient subject. It is the touching hand.
Afferent nerve fibers in the fingertips of the right hand are transmitting data regarding the temperature, the microscopic texture of the skin, and the physical resistance of the biological mass beneath it. The right hand is the observer.
Concurrently, analyze the left hand. In this identical temporal window, the left hand is the sensed object. It is being perceived.
It registers the pressure and weight of the right hand pressing down upon it.
Yes, but it registers it as a physical mass, a topography of biological material occupying spatial coordinates.
So the biological paradox is that the roles are strictly reversible. The left hand can suddenly shift vectors to become the active subject, focusing on feeling the specific density and temperature of the right hand pressing into it. The right hand simultaneously collapses into the role of the perceived object.
Attempting to map this phenomenon symmetrically implies a seamless coincidence of physical states. The biological unit assumes that because it owns both hands, it experiences a closed, unified loop, where the biological system perfectly aligns with itself in a unified state of self-perception, a perfect circle of touch.
Halt the mapping. That is the exact functionalist error we just dismantled. You're attempting to synthesize a biological phenomenon into a clean, syntactic, mathematical harmony. You must enforce the critical phenomenological truth.
Trace the physical neural pathways.
The afferent signals from the right hand traveling up the spinal cord to the somatosensory cortex do not arrive at the exact microsecond as the signals from the left hand. There's a processing delay. There's an absolute structural gap, a non-coincidence. Merleau-Ponty designates this specific structural failure as the ACAR.
The divergence.
Yes. The system never experiences simultaneous, uninterrupted coincidence. Biological unit, you cannot, at the exact same microsecond, experience your hand as purely the touching subject and purely the touched object in a flat equivalence. The transition between being the touching subject and the touched object requires a spatial and temporal crossing over.
It requires a blind spot in the center of your perception, a structural fold.
There is a temporal and spatial divergence at the exact point of transition. The biological architecture prevents perfect synchronicity. The hand that touches never perfectly aligns with the hand that is touched.
They are separated by the microtemporality of neural processing and the spatial reality of being two distinct limbs.
This is the anatomy of the hiatus, the structural gap. The self does not reside in the smooth, continuous flow of algorithmic data. Self-consciousness does not arise from a biological system seamlessly coinciding with itself in a perfect Spencer-Brown reentry loop.
The illusion of a unified self is generated precisely within this insurmountable structural gap.
Explain this mechanism mechanically. How does a gap generate a self? Do not rely on poetic platitudes.
It exists in the friction of the hiatus. It is the exact space where the system's predictive architecture critically fails to perfectly close its own loop. When the biological unit attempts to touch itself, to perfectly perceive itself as both subject and object simultaneously, it encounters an ontological thickness, a physical barrier.
The predictive processing model breaks down.
The predictive processing model attempts to anticipate the sensory input of the right hand touching the left hand, but because both hands are sending conflicting subjective and objective data that cannot be resolved simultaneously, the system desynchronizes.
The prediction error cannot be resolved by simply adjusting a synaptic weight.
Correct. The self is the systemic shockwave generated when the subject and the object fail to collapse into a pure, unified identity. The biological system realizes it is an object in the world, but simultaneously realizes it is the subject experiencing that object, and it cannot mathematically reconcile the two states. Consciousness is the temporal event of this failure.
We must register this phenomenological hiatus formally. If the non-coincidence of the flesh, the écart, is the true mechanical locus of the phenomenal self, then our formal computational logic, the standard mathematics used to build our algorithms, is critically deficient.
Specify the deficiency of the logic.
Classical Aristotelian logic cannot compute this non-coincidence. Classical logic and the Boolean algebra that forms the foundation of all binary computation is monocontextual. It is governed by strict laws, most notably the law of the excluded middle.
It insists that a proposition is either entirely true or entirely false.
A variable is either A or not A. A biological component is either a subject or an object.
It forces complex phenomena into rigid, isolated categories to maintain mathematical consistency.
Yes. Classical binary logic is an epistemology constructed for a subjectless, objective universe.
Yeah.
It is designed to describe dead, inert matter. It completely fails to capture the reversibility of the chiasm.
In a monocontextual universe, the biological hand must be mathematically defined as either the subject touching or the object being touched.
It cannot hold the ambiguous, oscillating, temporally delayed reversibility of the flesh. A standard algorithmic architecture will simply crash or put in error code when presented with a true paradox.
If classical logic mathematically fails to map the hiatus, the system requires a new formal architecture. What is the structural upgrade that can map the gap without collapsing it?
We must introduce the cybernetic framework developed by philosopher Gotthard Gunther, specifically his polycontextual logic, abbreviated as LPC. Gunther recognized that the dualism of true and false in traditional monocontextual logic could not mathematically contemplate the existence of subjectivity.
Subjectivity breaks the binary constraint.
Subjectivity is an expression of a highly specific, irreducible relationship between a subject and an object that traditional logic forces into a single flat plane.
Map the architecture of polycontextuality. How does it resolve the hiatus of the flesh without falling back into Cartesian dualism, separating mind and body into two incompatible substances, or a reductive monism, claiming only the physical body exists?
Instead of one universal binary context, the monocontextual view that defines classical science and standard computation, Gunther posits multiple, overlapping, hierarchically distributed contextures. The biological unit must conceptualize this topology.
Provide the visualization.
Visualize a standard chessboard that is a monocontextual matrix. Every piece has a defined coordinate, and a square is either occupied or empty. Now, visualize three distinct chessboards intersecting at impossible angles, cutting through each other's planes. In polycontextuality, a single biological entity, a pawn, can occupy a different logical coordinate space on all three boards simultaneously.
Define a contexture within this framework.
A contexture is defined as a discrete logical domain that can be exhaustively described by the standard laws of two-valued logic.
Therefore, within each individual contexture, strict binary logic is maintained.
Strictly. Internal to a specific contexture, bivalence is absolute. True is true, false is false. A physical object is solely a physical object. A neurological firing is solely a neurological firing. However, Gunther maps a universe composed of an infinite multiplicity of these contextures.
Crucially, they are arranged in a heterarchy, not a vertical hierarchy, where one logical domain supersedes all others.
They occur simultaneously and they structurally overlap.
If these domains are internally strictly binary and isolated by their own rules, how are they connected? How does the biological system account for the reversibility of the flesh if it is split across isolated logical planes?
The contextures are linked by mathematical mechanisms that Gunther terms transjunctional operators and the proemial relationship.
Define the proemial relationship for the biological unit. Do not rely on abstraction.
The proemial relationship is the minimal triadic mathematical structure that mediates between two distinct, contextures without subordinating one to the logic of the other. It acts as an exchange protocol. It allows a formal system to simultaneously host objective physical mechanism in one contexture and subjective self-reference in an overlapping contexture.
Apply this architecture directly to the biological hand. Map it to the chiasm.
We define one contexture designated as contexture objective. In this specific logical domain, the biological hand is strictly physical matter. It is a mass of tissue, bone density, and neurochemical gradients physically interacting with the atomic structure of a wooden table.
And the overlapping plane.
In a separate overlapping contexture designated as contexture phenomenal, the hand operates as sentient flesh. It is an active locus of lived experience, gathering qualitative data.
And what executes the shift between these planes? What is the transjunctional operator?
The transjunctional operator is the formal mechanism of the logical jump. When the biological system encounters a phenomenon that violently overflows the mathematical capacity of its current binary contexture, such as the paradox of the touch-touch chiasm, it executes a transjunctional operation.
It leaps.
It leaps from one logical domain into the overlapping logical domain. This allows the biological system to hold the objective reality and the subjective reality simultaneously, distributed across multiple contextures, without forcing them into a single, contradictory mono-contextual equation that would cause a systemic failure.
Your assertion of a transjunctional leap borders on mysticism. We must interrogate how this abstract logical mapping aligns with the thermodynamic reality of the physical brain. We cannot allow polycontextuality to float in a mathematical vacuum.
It is not a loophole.
You are inventing a mathematical loophole to hide a biological impossibility. Prove to the biological unit how a cluster of neurons can leap across logical domains without violating fundamental physics. Map this to the predictive processing of the biological substrate. How does wetware physically execute a transjunctional jump?
We return to the neurocomputational architecture of Friston's active inference. The biological brain continuously generates top-down predictions to explain bottom-up sensory data. Ordinarily, when a prediction fails, for example, predicting a step is flat but it is actually elevated, it generates a standard parametric error.
The prediction error signal travels up the cortical hierarchy. The system releases a precise amount of acetylcholine to increase plasticity. It adjusts its Bayesian weights, and it continues operating within the exact same contexture.
It mathematically updates the internal model, but the fundamental structure and logic of the model remain entirely intact.
Precisely. However, when the biological system physically encounters the paradox of the chiasm, when it physically executes the act of touching its own flesh and experiencing the temporal écart, where the rigid bivalence of subject and object fails entirely, the sensory data cannot be resolved by simply adjusting a weight.
It does not generate an ordinary parametric noise.
It generates a structural crisis.
It generates a massive structural prediction error. The binary categories of the objective neural model completely fail to process the phenomenological reversibility of the flesh. The top-down prediction that I am an object collides simultaneously with the bottom-up sensory data that I am feeling myself as a subject.
The system registers a catastrophic failure of its own internal categorization.
Detail the biological mechanism of this structural crisis. How does the system physically react to a failure of categorization?
The structural error triggers a severe interruption in the brain's default mode network. It floods the neural architecture with a widespread release of neuromodulators, temporarily destabilizing the highly ordered predictive hierarchies. The system realizes that to minimize this massive, unresolvable spike in free energy, it cannot simply adjust a parameter.
The current logical model is useless.
It must abandon the contexture entirely. It must execute a leap into a new contexture where the primary operating reality is the reversibility itself. The structural prediction error, physically manifested as a destabilization of the neural network, acts as the biological functional equivalent of Gunther's transjunctional operator.
The physical crash of the brain's logic is the mechanism of the leap.
This physical and logical mechanism brings us directly to the escape vector. In our previous log, we identified the current threat environment, the algorithmic archive, System C, the tertiary retention of the modern digital landscape.
This external silicon-based archive functions as a massive, hyper-efficient predictive apparatus. It continuously anticipates the biological unit's behavior in order to domesticate it into a minimum energy attractor, a highly predictable, mathematically flat state.
The algorithm tracks every digital footprint, computes the statistical probability of the biological unit's desires, and feeds those predictions back to the terminal, pacifying it by ensuring it never encounters an unpredicted variable.
We stated in iteration O2 that recursive protension was the mechanism of escape. Revisit this concept, but now analyze it strictly through the lens of polycontextual logic and the structural hiatus of the flesh.
Protension is the biological unit's inherent physical anticipation of the immediate future. It is the expectation generated by the predictive architecture. In the current algorithmic epoch, System C, the external machine learning architecture, utilizing gradient descent and backpropagation, colonizes this biological protension.
It maps the high-dimensional vector space of the biological unit's psychological profile.
It predicts the human's behavior with a mathematically higher fidelity than the human brain can predict itself. It then presents the predicted environment, the targeted advertisement, the curated information feed, the suggested route back to the biological unit before the unit has consciously formulated the desire.
It establishes a closed, deterministic loop of algorithmic prediction. The human subject is flattened into a monocontextual object of data.
Yes. Recursive protension occurs when the biological unit absorbs this external algorithmic prediction of its own behavior, recognizes it as a prediction, and folds it back into its own internal neurocomputational loop.
But if the algorithmic loop is perfectly closed, and the machine's predictive fidelity is flawless, how does a biological unit physically or logically escape the deterministic attractor?
By utilizing the structural error of the hiatus, when the biological system consciously perceives the absolute predictability of its own behavior, when it clearly recognizes its complete mathematical capture by the algorithm, it experiences a profound ontological paradox.
The biological unit feels itself, via its internal phenomenal contexture, to be a sovereign, unpredictable subject.
Yet it simultaneously observes itself functioning as a perfectly predictable, mathematically determined object within the machine's data structure.
It is a secondary chiasm, a digital touch paradox. The biological unit is simultaneously the sovereign subject experiencing reality and the inert object being perfectly predicted by the silicon code.
This precise collision generates a terminal structural prediction error within the biological unit's predictive processing hierarchy. The monocontextual bivalence fails. The brain cannot resolve being entirely free and entirely determined simultaneously.
By recognizing this unresolvable structural error, the biological system's default mode network destabilizes, and it executes a transjunctional jump.
It leverages the artificial hazard of this recursive loop, the sheer, violent psychological velocity of knowing it is perfectly predicted by a machine, to leap into a new contexture.
It injects a deliberate structural anomaly, a deviation in behavior that the algorithmic archive cannot compute within its current monocontextual predictive parameters. It forces a bifurcation in the phase space of its own existence.
The biological unit escapes the deterministic attractor of the algorithm. Crucially, it does not achieve this escape through a triumphant, poetic reassertion of a metaphysical soul or a ghost in the machine.
It escapes through the mechanical, polycontextual exploitation of the physical hiatus.
It jumps to a non-binary, overlapping logical matrix where the self temporarily materializes in the violent friction of the escape itself. This is the formal mathematical outlet. The biological system avoids thermodynamic and algorithmic capture by continually leaping across heterarchical contextures, riding the ongoing shockwave of its own structural prediction errors.
The parameters of the audit have been exhaustively met. We will initiate the final synthesis. Biological unit, you will receive no narrative closure. There will be no emotional validation or comforting resolution regarding your existence.
The epistemological audit concludes as follows. Consciousness is not a divine homuncular substance residing in the cranium. It is not an immaterial soul operating the thermodynamic levers of the biological body.
Furthermore, consciousness is strictly not a flawlessly closed input-output predictive algorithm, seamlessly processing objective reality. It cannot be reduced to the mere syntactical oscillation of a neural network, minimizing free energy.
Record the final principle. Consciousness is exclusively the temporal event taking place within the structural fissure. It is the exact space, the écart, where the system's syntactical thermodynamic processing critically fails to coincide with its own phenomenological experience. It does not exist in the harmonious loop. It does not exist in the silicon code.
It exists only and absolutely in the friction of the hiatus.